where it focused on covering how cannabis markets and investments were evolving internationally. Now, I'm checking if it has his mic on, and it does. So, from Uruguay, living in Germany, please welcome Alfredo Pascual.
Thank you. All right, is this ready? Yeah, so, oops. So you might be wondering what an investment analyst is doing speaking about the single convention and all this weird international law stuff. And that would be a good question. The reason is that before I even started working in the cannabis industry, I did a master's degree on public policy in Germany, and I focused on drug policy reform in particular. I've been attending these mysterious meetings in Vienna quite a few times, even before there was a cannabis industry or a so-called cannabis industry in Europe. And this is a topic that has always fascinated me. And of course, I need to say that I am not a lawyer, and I'm not here to say what is legal or not legal when it comes to international law and the possibility of legalizing adult use cannabis. For the most part, what I will be doing is to try to summarize what I see as potential challenges from countries that might oppose Germany or Portugal or other countries legalizing adult use cannabis. Before I start the key part of the presentation, I also think it is important to emphasize how important international law is in general, and also when it comes to the infamous in the cannabis industry single convention. We tend to think that that is simply about cannabis prohibition, but it's not just that, or it's actually quite a different thing. It's an instrument that allows the orderly trade of controlled medicines internationally. And I often hear in the sector, well, we just ignore it. It's old stuff. Nobody cares about that anymore. But I think it's more complicated than that. And we should be careful when we say we should just simply ignore international law, because it still is key to prevent conflicts. And I know everyone will be thinking now about Russia. But that being said, we tend to focus on when international law fails and not when it works. And most of the time it still works. And we don't want a world where every country is doing its own thing and simply not caring about rules of international, in the case of the single convention, trade of medicines. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides here explaining the example of Uruguay, which legalized cannabis in December 2013, so quite a long time ago. And I think it did so in a very elegant way, at least for what was the situation back then. And I put this here in all caps on purpose, because again, I hear all the time, oh, Uruguay simply disregarded the single convention and other instruments of international law, and nothing happened. So if Uruguay did it, anyone else can do it as well. And let's just ignore the international treaties just like Uruguay did. Well, that's not true. Uruguay did not simply ignore the international treaties. Actually, back then in 2012-13, there was a lot of diplomatic work from Uruguayan authorities in Vienna trying to explain the Uruguayan position of why Uruguay was doing what it was doing. And I think it did so in a pretty good way, and I'm going to try to explain how it was done. But before doing that, we need to understand how usually international law is to be interpreted. This is quite complicated to explain in a single slide, but in a nutshell, there's this article of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is a treaty about treaties, basically, a treaty about international treaties, which explains how international treaties are to be interpreted. And the way that it should be done, it's like a circle of these three things. One is a textual interpretation of the treaty, meaning what the words mean simply without any context, without anything else. Another one is the context interpretation, meaning what the drafters of the treaty intended when they were doing so. And the third one, which is the key here, is that it needs to be interpreted in light of its object and purpose. So when we do this with the single convention, this treaty that is often mentioned in the sector that restricts, in the case of cannabis, it's used for medical and scientific purposes. If we do a textual interpretation, it looks pretty bad, that we will not have much of a chance legalizing cannabis for adult use purposes and justifying that with the text of the single convention. If we look at the context, there's the commentary on the single convention, which is a very long text, basically providing all the context of how it was drafted. And again, it looks pretty bad. But if we look at the object and purpose, things start to look better. And what Uruguay did was to say, we are still fully committed to international law, and in particular the single convention and other instruments of international law that regulate narcotics. But what we are seeing is that the way that the single convention has been implemented these past few decades simply has not worked to achieve its purpose. And what's the purpose of the single convention? Just read the very first pages, and when you go to the preamble, it starts with the parties concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. So I think Uruguay had a brilliant argument back then, saying that this prohibition simply has not worked to advance the health and welfare of mankind. We need to do something different, and that's what we are gonna do. We are gonna maybe, they didn't say it like that, but it could be said that Uruguay stretched the interpretation of the treaty to fulfill its objective. And I think that was brilliant, back then at least. And how did Uruguay justify this is also interesting, because it was not simply we will legalize and see what happens, it is we will do it quite in alignment with many things that are written in the convention. So there were two key pillars in the legalization in Uruguay. One was harm reduction, understood both as health and safety. So this is key because that's what the single convention is about, at least the health part. So what Uruguay said is basically users having access to substance in the illicit market are not being protected in terms of health or safety. So we want to legalize to start protecting them. And then state control, which again was key. Uruguay never intended to create an industry, at least back in 2012-13. The objective was not commercial, it was to protect the health and safety of citizens, and for that, the argument is we will have a lot of state control. Maybe seen 20 years later, almost 20 years later, it looks like too much. I agree with that, but back then, it was basically all what Uruguay could do to avoid annoying neighboring countries, for example, and that's the reason why cannabis tourism was not allowed in the Uruguayan legalization. So again, that was in a nutshell the argument of Uruguay: harm reduction and state control. The law follows the spirit of the convention. Just look at the preamble. This is what we are gonna do. And there were a couple of other arguments in the case of Uruguay, which was one, the primacy of human rights, again connected with the health issue. Uruguay said we have a bunch of international obligations. It's not just about the single convention and other drug treaties. Yes, controlling drugs is part of international law, but there's more than that in international law. And there's the famous primacy of human rights. And if humans have the right to health, we need to prioritize that rather than controlling drugs. So we will first prioritize the health of our citizens, then we will continue controlling drugs. And then there's the primacy of the Constitution. Again, this was another argument that Uruguay used back then, and what you can read there it's the actual text of the 1961 convention in the case of the first one, and the other one is the 1988 convention, I think, which in several parts it says that this convention basically applies, but subject to the constitution of the countries signatories to the convention. And in the case of Uruguay, again, Uruguay used the constitutional argument that had priority. So that's how Uruguay did it. I'm not saying that's how every country should do it. It's simply an example of how it was done to legalize adult use cannabis. In the case of Uruguay, arguing that it was compliant with international law. Uruguay never acknowledged a violation, but there are other options that may work as well. And I'm gonna quickly go through the different types of options. So not necessarily one is better than the other, these are simply different options. So the first one is rescheduling or also descheduling cannabis, because again, speaking only about the single convention now, you have the text of the single convention and then you have schedules to it where different substances are included. Think about it like attachments and annexes. And we probably all heard about what happened in December 2020 when the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, basically the countries signatories of the convention, decided to remove cannabis from Schedule 4 of the 1961 convention. That was a historic, symbolic move, because with that they were implicitly acknowledging the medical use of cannabis, but cannabis still remained in Schedule 1, and the way that the schedules work is a little bit weird, but Schedule 1 in a nutshell still means the highest level of control. To do that, it was very complicated. It took years of diplomatic efforts. It took a WHO report on cannabis as well, and at the end of the day it could be done, but the vote was won by simple majority, but just by 2 votes. So it was 27 to 25 with 1 abstention, I think. So it was quite complicated. And here we're talking about a cosmetic change of cannabis for medical use. So with this, what I mean is there's little to no chance that we will see, probably in the near future at least, cannabis being completely descheduled from the convention, removed from the convention, because it's just not realistic. Another option is an amendment, which again could be done. It's in the text of the single convention that is possible, but it's complicated. In legal terms, it's not that difficult. If a country wants to amend the convention, they simply can present a proposal, and then they can even force a vote on that. But in practical terms, it's much more complicated than that, because, well, first you would need to convince half of the world to agree on removing cannabis from the single convention, or amending the convention for it not to control cannabis. And secondly, the problem with cannabis is that it's not about the single convention only. It's 3 different instruments of international law that regulate cannabis in different ways, and all 3 would need to be modified, and that's mission impossible. It's really complicated because each of these treaties has different procedures for their modification. So again, in legal terms, it's possible. In practical terms, more complicated. And then another option is withdrawing from the convention. We don't like it, so we quit, basically. Again, in legal terms, that's super easy. A country simply needs to send a letter, and then with that, depending on what time of the year that is done, 6 months or 1 year later, the country is not bounded by those obligations anymore. In legal terms, that's easy, but it's quite risky in political, economical, and reputational ways. There's no precedent of a country simply denouncing the convention without re-entering it, and I really doubt that any European country would do that anytime soon. And then there's the very famous example of Bolivia that is being mentioned a lot these days, which denounced the convention, but then re-entered it with a reservation regarding coca leaves. Again, this is, in legal terms, quite easy to do. In practical terms, things are usually more complicated, and the reason is that for that to work, then fewer than 1/3 of the countries signatories to the convention, which are basically all of the countries in the world, need to not oppose that. So if more than 1/3 of the countries oppose that move, then re-entering the convention would not be possible. So it's a risky move. Imagine if a country would simply denounce the convention with the hope to then re-enter with a reservation, and then it happens that more than 1/3 of the countries oppose that move. That would mean that country, in theory or in practice even, would remain outside the convention, and that would make a lot of things really complicated when it comes to the international trade of controlled medicines. So it's possible, it's complicated. And the other thing is, how would Germany justify it? So when Bolivia did it, it did so based on indigenous traditions that were ancient in Bolivia when it comes to the use of coca leaves, not cocaine. And Germany would, or Portugal would need to come up with a very good argument. It is not simply that I mean, in legal terms, it's the same. Germany or Portugal could say, we want to do it simply because we want to do it. It doesn't need to be justified on traditional use, but a justification like the one of Bolivia, let's say, it helps make a good argument to convince other countries not to oppose that move. And one more thing about this, if Germany were to move with something like this, previously, I'm of the very strong opinion that the German government should apologize to Bolivia and correct an historical mistake, because Germany was one of the very few countries that opposed Bolivia doing this. I think it was like probably less than a dozen countries that opposed Bolivia doing this, so it was not enough to get to the 1/3 that would have been needed to block Bolivia from doing this, and Germany was one of the very few countries that opposed that move. So I think Germany, before talking about legalizing and doing this to solve this international issue should apologize to Bolivia. By the way, there's the president of Mexico that, again, opposed Bolivia doing that, but then they withdrew that opposition, a symbolic move, but still important. And then there's the inter se option, which is I'm starting to hearing it all the time now. I think it will be used more and more in the following months, this option in terms of the debate. And I'm afraid it's starting to be used in the cannabis industry, like the GMP term was used a couple of years ago, that it was thrown around all the time, GMP. Now I think we're going to start hearing inter se all of the time. In my role as in my daily job as an investor, I am already receiving proposals for investing opportunities of companies that plan to export to Germany for recreational purposes before there's even a bill. And whenever I ask how you're planning to do it, I already getting the inter se word or term thrown around. So is that possible? Yes, it is possible, but again, it's a little bit complicated. How it could work is that it would be some sort of group of countries, like-minded countries, think Germany, Portugal, maybe Malta, Luxembourg, Netherlands, that among themselves would establish specific rules that would apply only among themselves, and they would keep their obligations when it comes to the single convention and other instruments of international law. And this is also regulated by the Vienna law that I mentioned that regulates other treaties in Article 41, but it's uncharted territory. In terms of it has not been done for cases like this before. And there are a few issues with that. First is that the treaty that I mentioned that regulates other treaties is entered into force in 1980, and its Article 4 specifically says that it does not apply retroactively, and the single convention is from 61, it was then modified in 71, but in any case it's previous to 1980. There's a counter argument to that, and it is that what that treaty did was simply to codify what was already customary international law, so they didn't reinvent the wheel with the inter se option. It was something that already existed. This was simply codified in the treaty, so that would mean that it would indeed apply retroactively because it was something that existed already, but that's debatable at least. And there are a couple of other issues with that, including that for an inter se option to be valid, then the countries that would be doing that would need to make sure that they would not affect other countries in their obligations to the single convention and other instruments of drug control. And that's, again, easier said than done, because if Germany or Portugal legalize cannabis and then you have a bunch of cannabis tourism going to, for example, Germany, it could be the case that other European countries would say, hey, you are making our life more complicated in terms of drug control, and that could be an argument against an inter se modification. And then to finish, because I'm getting some signals already, we have EU law, which is another Pandora box, basically. There's not a lot new when it comes to EU law. It's basically about the implementation on a European Union level of those international treaties. Again, they're not reinventing the wheel with these things. And there are three things that could be an issue. The first one is a little more complicated to read. I did that on purpose because that has been repealed in 2006. But it's still important to consider it, because when it was repealed in 2006, it was done because it was considered to be obsolete because of this other framework decision, which is the key part of EU law that regulates these things. And this framework decision, again, it's a little bit complicated because it basically does not allow to legalize commercial cannabis production for non-medical purposes. And it has a key word there, which is without right. So countries, in a nutshell, will not be able to legalize cannabis for recreational purposes without right. So the key is what without right means. If we go to the Green Party bill that in Germany that was presented a couple of years ago, they acknowledged this issue and they said, well, without right, we're going to legalize, so then it's going to be legal. This doesn't apply to us anymore. Of course, they didn't say it with those terms, but if you read the bill, that's the impression that it gives you, that they are thinking. And I mean, I think that's wishful thinking, because when this was drafted in 2004, the idea was to harmonize law in Europe in terms of drug control. It was not to to keep the door open for countries to then do whatever they want and simply say, because it's legal here, then this doesn't apply anymore. But I recommend each one of you to actually read this article and get your own conclusions there. And what's interesting about the framework decision is Article 2, the second part, which very explicitly indeed allows legalizing for personal consumption, so growing at home. And this is certainly okay. There's also the Schengen acquis, which is another level of problem. And again, this is issue, right? It's about illicit traffic. You should read articles 71 to 75 approximately. And if you see there, it's always about the illicit trafficking or illicit whatever with cannabis. And there's always the argument, well, if we make it legal, then it's not illicit, it doesn't apply to us anymore. I think it's a matter of international diplomacy more than interpreting the law. So what's for sure doable without many issues? Decriminalization, that's certainly possible within international law. There's no doubt about it. It has been done in Portugal and other countries as well to different extents. It's also possible to legalize cultivation for personal use. Again, this has been done in different countries, including in the European Union. No big issues there. And then I think it's also interesting to think about scientific experiments, because when you read the Single Convention and other instruments of international law regulating narcotics, they always talk about medical and scientific uses, but that is not defined. So what is medical? We had that debate yesterday. And what is scientific? That is not defined. So let's say that a very open medical program arguably could be okay, and scientific experiments as well, because does scientific means only clinical trials, or does scientific also include social issues? If it includes social issues, then that's also justifiable. So I do like the Switzerland approach. So these things are definitely possible. They have happened already. More than that, we'll have to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Quick correction. We still have Stephen George. My mistake. I'm sorry, Stephen. So it's not coffee break yet. Now, questions and answers are open. Would you please raise your hand if you have a question? Shy audience. There you have.
Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, it was very open-minded. But I have a question, which is, I think I know the answer already, but even if one country abandoned or somehow decided to leave the convention, it still not apply, let's say Bolivia. If Bolivia or Uruguay wants to export to Germany, they still have to comply with the German law.
Can you paraphrase the question, repeat the question in different
So
words?
even if one country decided to withdraw from the convention, if they want to export to another country, they still have to follow the rules of the destination country.
So if a country were to denounce the convention, then the obligations do not apply to that country anymore. At least that's, if you read it in legal terms, the convention wouldn't apply anymore. That country would be free to do whatever it wants. Then, so you could then make the case, what if two countries withdraw from the convention? Then the obligations do not apply to these two countries anymore. Yeah, in legal terms, that would work. In practical terms, that's always more complicated because of the risks involved there. And there's another thing that is quite important, and it's connected with EU law as well, and it is that these conventions, in particular the Single Convention, are not like isolated from other instruments of international law or treaties among countries for commercial purposes or other things. So many times there are like commercial agreements, for example, between countries that have as a requisite that these countries comply with the Single Convention, for example. Don't forget that now this is very old, it's maybe not fit for purpose anymore, it's outdated, but 20 years ago this was still pretty much consensus internationally. So, I mean, in legal terms, what you are proposing, yeah, countries withdraw from the convention, then start trading among each other. That is possible. In practical terms, that would be more complicated because of the political risks of doing that, and also because there are other things connected with the Single Convention.
Thank you. Another question right over there.
Based on the risks around legalization with all the different countries, as
Could you please speak a little bit louder?
Sure.
Sorry.
Based on all of the risks around the legality of this in all the different countries, how are you navigating the investment side of things? Like, how do you decide which countries to invest in, which products, all of those other pieces?
Great question. I like it. As an investor, I need to consider different scenarios. I try to be optimistic, but I also need to consider what could go wrong. And yeah, sometimes things go wrong or things take longer than we would expect. And for me, that means that investing in a company with a business plan that is contingent upon regulatory change that still has not happened is very risky. So yeah, it would need to be considered as an extremely risky scenario. And we should also consider precedents of other countries that were about to legalize adult use and then for one reason or another didn't end up doing that. And there are quite a few of those. We have the example in the European Union of Luxembourg that with the coalition that came into power in 2018, they had it in its agreement to fully legalize cannabis, including for commercial purposes. Then they basically decided to this year legalize growing at home for personal use only. It could be that part of the explanation of that is EU law, or simply that they are waiting for Germany to go first to avoid any trouble, and if Germany does it, then Luxembourg will do it as well. But there are other examples as well. We have the example of Israel that basically 2 years ago had a government which again had the consensus and the intention to legalize adult use. They even promised a timeline of 12 months. Then what happened? The government fell, so they couldn't do it. Now the actual government in Israel doesn't seem like it will do it. We have the example of Mexico, that if you start reading headlines of the last few years in Mexico, it seems like it legalized adult use a bunch of times. It's still not legal there. It's complicated. You have the Supreme Court decisions, but the parliament hasn't done it, so you don't have a regulated market. And with this, where I'm going is that it's risky to expect adult use legalization for your business plan. So as an investor, if the business plan only makes sense if adult use is legalized, I would tend to look at it very carefully. If the business plan makes sense without adult use, then adult use would be a plus, nice to have, but it would need to make sense without that.
Thank you. There's another one in the back. I think it's the final one.
No.
No. Oh, sorry. So we have
Hi,
two more
Alfredo.
and we have to close.
Thank you for an elucidative presentation as always. I wanted to ask you for a brief question to a recent paper that was published by Kenzie Ribble Zemoli, that basically states that the conventions are in a way just guidance or framework guidelines to regulate either medical and non-medical applications. And from his paper, he explains that non-medical parts non-medical legislation can be done if follows that two requirements, that is implement effective measures to avoid harms and provide reliable statistics to INCB. What's your opinion on this work in particular? I think you know it.
Yeah, I know it. Great. Thank you for your question. I would need another half an hour to discuss that paper.
You don't have it.
So first of all, I do know Kenzie very well. I would even consider him an industry friend. And I've been seeing him at every meeting that I went to in Vienna. So he has been more involved probably than anyone else in this room and in the cannabis industry when it comes to these things. But I disagree with that paper largely. I think it's a purely textual interpretation of, in particular, one article of the single convention, Article 2, Paragraph 9, if I remember correctly. And that article was, I think it's quite clear that it was intended for industrial purposes. It was not intended for adult use legalization. And I say in my opinion, it's a selective interpretation of that article, ignoring other articles, because you have many other parts of the convention that are very clear in terms of the limits of medical and scientific purposes. You have Article 4, which is a general obligation, and it's very clear there that countries should limit that to medical and scientific purposes. And the other thing is that, I mean, Kenzie might be right let's say Kenzie is right in his textual interpretation of Article 2.9, I think it is, that would mean that during the past 50 years, everyone else has been wrong, right? And it's going to be a tough battle to tell everyone that they have all been wrong because Kenzie just found this textual interpretation of that article that allows adult use. I mean, again, I always say that there's a difference between textual interpretation and what in legal terms things might mean and what could happen in practice. So even if let's give Kenzie credit and he's right about his textual interpretation, I don't think it is, but again, it would be a long discussion. The other thing is, does it matter? Like, would countries care about that? And I pretty much doubt it, that any country would go to Vienna to say, hey, I have Kenzie's interpretation here, look, it's possible. Not gonna happen.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, thanks for your perspective, Alfredo. I'm a globalist, and but I think the UN is an institution of haves and have-nots. What does UN enforcement of the single convention on narcotics look like?
Almost nothing. So you have the example of Uruguay and Canada. You will receive some, I mean, if countries legalize for adult use and they don't do crazy stuff, like shipping to other countries, for example, at most they would receive some love letters from the INCB, which is the organism in charge of enforcing the conventions, if you want, and it would be about dialogue. So if you see that is explained in the single convention, so how enforcement works. And the first steps are a few steps about dialogue with the countries, right? So it's about dialogue at the beginning. In very, very, very extreme cases, it could be that international trade of medicines to these countries is somehow restricted. However, that would need other countries to actually want to do it. It's not simply about the INCB wanting to restrict the trades of medicines. And in 2022, 2023, I really doubt that any country would be blocked from essential medicines simply because that country is legalizing cannabis. So again, in terms of enforcement directly from the UN, in the case of the INCB, it is almost nothing, I would say, but the risk is always reputational. It's always diplomatic, right? So if you have countries saying, hey, what Russia is doing is illegal, and Russia's argument of self-defense is bullshit, then Russia could say, hey, what you're doing is also illegal, right? So it's always about that balance of diplomacy and politics more than about the real enforcement from the UN agency when it comes to the single convention.
Thank you so much. An applause to Alfredo
Thank
Pascual.
you.
Thank you.